Let's begin. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen to h5, check. Answer to this puzzle is Queen takes pawn, check. King to f8. Queen to f7, checkmate. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are. There are no threats in this position. Here are the checks. Knight to d6, check. Knight to g3, checkmate. Rook to g5, check. Rook to f4, check. The answer is Knight to g3, checkmate. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Here are the checks. Rook to c1, check. Knight to d2, check. The puzzle is solved using Knight to d2, check. King to a1. Rook to c1, checkmate. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes pawn. The checks are. Queen to h7, check. Queen to h6, check. Queen to h5, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e8, check. The answer is Queen to h5, check. King to f6. Bishop to g5, checkmate. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Knight takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are. Knight to f3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight to f3, check. King to h1. Queen takes pawn, checkmate. One more. Threats in this position are. There are no threats in this position. The checks are. Queen to f6, check. Queen to f8, check. Queen to g5, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Queen to f8, check. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen, checkmate. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Rook to h8, check. Rook to g6, check. Queen to c4, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to b3, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Queen to h7, check. King to f8. Rook to f6, checkmate. Let's continue. The threats are. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Queen to e4, check. Queen to f3, checkmate. Queen to g1, check. Queen to c1, check. Knight to g3, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Queen to f3, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Rook to h2, check. Rook to g3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to h2, check. King to f1. Rook to h1, check. King to f2. Rook to h2, checkmate. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. The checks are. Queen to h6, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Queen to g5. Rook to g8. Queen to h5, check. Bishop to h6, check. Queen takes bishop, checkmate. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook to a1, check. The answer is. King to g3. Rook to d5. Rook to a1, check. Rook to d1. Rook takes rook, checkmate. One more. Here are the threats. Queen takes knight. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Queen to f8, check. Queen to f4, check. Queen to c1, check. Queen to f6, check. Rook to f2, check. Rook to c1, check. The puzzle is solved using. Queen to c1, check. Queen to d1. Queen takes queen, checkmate. Another puzzle. The threats are. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook takes pawn, check. Pawn takes rook. Rook to h2, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are. Knight to c6, check. Solution to the puzzle is. King to c5. f3. Knight to c6, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook to d2, checkmate. Rook to a1, check. The puzzle is solved using. Rook to d2, checkmate. Another one. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Bishop to e2, check. Rook to g5, check. Rook to h3, check. The puzzle is solved using. Bishop to e2, check. King to h4. Bishop to g5, checkmate. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are. Knight takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Here are the checks. Knight takes pawn, check. Rook to c3, check. Rook to d2, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook to d2, check. King takes knight. Knight to d6, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes queen, check. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook to g7, check. Rook to g8, check. Rook to g5, check. Rook to g4, check. Rook to g3, check. Rook to g2, check. Rook to g1, check. Rook takes queen, check. The puzzle is solved using. Rook to g7, check. King takes pawn. Queen to h7, checkmate. Another puzzle. The threats are. Rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. The checks are. Queen to f3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to c6, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to f3, check. King to f1. Queen to h1, checkmate. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes queen. King takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook to c8, check. Rook to f7, check. Rook to h8, check. Rook to f7, check. The answer is. Rook to c8, check. Rook to d8. Rook takes rook, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. The checks are. Queen to h7, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen to f7, check. Queen to d8, check. Queen to c8, check. Queen to b8, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Queen to c8, check. King to b6. Queen to c6, check. King to a5. Queen to b5, checkmate. Next, the threats are. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Checks in this position are. Queen to g7, check. Queen to f8, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to f6, check. Rook to f8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to f8, check. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook, checkmate. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes queen. Bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen to c2, check. Queen to c1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to c2, check. King to a1. Queen to c1, checkmate. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Here are the checks. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to f7, check. Queen to g8, check. The puzzle is solved using. Queen to g8, check. Rook takes queen. Knight to f7, checkmate. Let's continue. Threats in this position are. Queen takes rook. Rook takes pawn, check. The checks are. Rook takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Rook takes pawn, check. King to g8. Queen to f7, checkmate. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.